Hey, church family. Tonight we continue our series on the prophets of the Old Testament. Tonight's study is on the amazing prophecy of Daniel. It's been said by some that Daniel seems to be the favorite prophet of Jesus. Well, he certainly is a popular prophet in the New Testament. A great deal of the New Testament concerns itself about the fulfillment of the prophecy of Daniel. Daniel speaks to a critical time in the history of the chosen people of God. It's a pivotal time. It's a time when all of the prophecies of the Old Testament will be fulfilled and the promises to Abraham will be made sure in the person of Jesus Christ. It's all about Jesus. So here, Daniel's prophecy is terribly misunderstood. For many years, it was assumed that Daniel's prophecy was actually written late in the 2nd century BC because the events that Daniel described were like reading a history book. And when we get to those parts of his prophecy, we'll see it's a very detailed prophecy. It's a specific prophecy. It's one that has a very specific fulfillment in Daniel's future and largely in our past. So it was thought by scholars to represent a history or something that was written after the events that it describes. And that was until the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls and discovery of copies of the prophecy of Daniel that actually predate the events that Daniel will describe in such detail. So it's an amazing and specific prophecy, and it's an extremely important prophecy. The events that are contained in this book of prophecy of Daniel take up a large portion of New Testament scripture. The events that he speaks of are the subject of the Olivet Discourse. And so the 13th chapter of Mark, the 21st chapter of Luke, and the 24th chapter of Matthew are all dedicated to the specific fulfillments that are prophesied by Daniel. The large portion of the book of Revelation, in my reading, is occupied by an apocalyptic revelation of the events of Daniel. From the 9th chapter of Revelation, beginning with the events of the 6th trumpet, all the way through the 14th chapter of Revelation, are all concerned themselves with events that will be prophesied by Daniel. And it's very important that those things be understood, because imagery in the Revelation will be drawn from all the Old Testament prophets, but these events find their most specific foretelling in the prophecy of Daniel. So it's a fascinating, amazing book. And it has some components, several components. It has a sort of historical component that tells the story of Daniel and includes the characters of the 3 Hebrew children we recount most commonly by their Babylonian names of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are their Hebrew names. Now, Daniel is always referred to by Daniel, not by Belteshazzar. Now, Belteshazzar is the name that Nebuchadnezzar gives him, and we know it has something to do with the chief god of Nebuchadnezzar, Bel, or the Hebrew equivalent would be Baal, a Hebrew word that means master. It's also a word that's used for husband and has some other uses. Words often do double or triple duty in Hebrew. But the name Belteshazzar is given to him by Nebuchadnezzar, who admits that it has something to do with the name of his god, Bel. Now, it needs to be disambiguated and distinguished from Belshazzar, that we will see in the 5th chapter, the king of Babylon, in the story of the handwriting on the wall. Belteshazzar is a little bit obscure linguistically. And I'm not sure that the Chaldean version of the name is all that important. It may mean Bel protects. It may also, interestingly, mean Bel does not protect him, that he has protection from elsewhere. But what is most interesting to me is that when it's transliterated into Hebrew, it means the master of hidden treasure. And certainly Daniel qualifies, above all in the Old Testament, of being the master of hidden treasure. And so let's study this sort of chapter by chapter, because it's a succession of stories and a succession of visions that Daniel has, that he is offered the interpretation of. Now, a lot of the history, for us history, future for Daniel, that Daniel, from our perspective, describes, has been obscure. There are things that Daniel prophesies and talks about that theologians in the past have not had the information to deal with. There's a history of the Jewish rebellion, the great falling away that Paul talks about in 2 Thessalonians, that we are usually unaware of that history in its entirety. We know about the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, but that was not the end of the great falling away, the great rebellion, because it culminated in the revelation of a son of destruction, a son of perdition, a man of lawlessness that Daniel will make reference to. And theologians were completely unaware. The only evidence of that history for the church was a few snippets from the patristic literature, the letters of the church fathers, the passing mention by Eusebius, the church historian, and commentary in the Jewish Talmud, which is really quite obscure. You know, it's not easy to read the Talmud. It's 30-something volumes of the writings and arguments between rabbis. It is the most important and most authoritative scripture for modern Judaism, which is unfortunate, but it supersedes even the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, in its authority. And it's the Babylonian Talmud that is considered superior to the Jerusalem Talmud even. More of that reference of Mystery Babylon, I suppose. But in the Talmud, it tells about the history of the Jewish rebellion and its culmination in the Bar Kokhba revolt. And Bar Kokhba, son of a star, is a story that we need to get into. I don't know how much of that I'll actually do, but suffice it to say that you need to look it up and read it there, if you'll ask me, at church or elsewhere. Where you can find the information. It's really quite easily found in a very simple form. It can be found online. It can be found on YouTube videos, and there's really very little reason for you not to educate yourselves on the Great Jewish Rebellion from 66 AD all the way to 135 AD, because those events are described in gory detail in the 13th and 14th chapters of Revelation, and in the prophecy here of Daniel. And I'll point out as we go along the sources, the source of the prophecy inside of these words of Daniel. But in the first chapter of Daniel, we see an introduction. And we know that, like Ezekiel, Daniel is taken into Babylonian captivity very early in the first wave of exiles, when Nebuchadnezzar sieges Jerusalem and captures King Joachim with an M on the end, as opposed to his son Joachim with an N, and takes him to Babylon captive, and carries off articles from the temple of God that Isaiah foretold. After Hezekiah showed the Babylonians all the riches of his palace and the temple, Isaiah says, "You don't know what you've done." He said, "You won't live to see it, but they're going to come back and they're going to carry all this away, and your people as well. So Isaiah's prophecy was certainly fulfilled here, and Daniel, as a young man, was taken to Babylon with other sons of royalty. Now, those events are really well understood and taught in Sunday school, and we know the story of the 3 Hebrew children, and we know Daniel in the lion's den, and we know a lot of things about the historical stories in Daniel, but the fulfillment of the prophetic portions is something that's been really quite obscure, and the interpretations that we've been offered of those prophecies in the past are now obsolete in light of historical artifacts and archaeology and a story that has unfolded that reads like that makes Daniel read like a history book yet again. And so I'll be offering you interpretations of those things and can go into more detail if anyone is interested. We'll try to hit the high points here to give you an overview, because the period of time that Daniel prophesies about and the end time that the prophecy of Daniel anticipates is not the end time largely. There are few little snippets that I think do apply to the end time that are rapidly approaching us. And we are very rapidly approaching an end time. It is upon us. It is time for Christ and his church to be exalted and for the judgment of the wicked. But the end time that Daniel talks about is the end time for his people. It culminates in the coming of their Messiah, and then the liberation of his people spiritually, but their destruction physically for those who reject their king. Now, and that's what all this is about. It is all about the most important period of time in the history of the Jewish nation, that those birth pains that will result in the Messiah's coming, and the tragedy and the judgment that also surrounds that. And so we'll see that story told in Daniel, and it's an amazing tale that it's an amazing prophecy that Daniel unfolds, and it's so specific as it cannot be denied. Oh, here we see Daniel and the 3 Hebrew children in Babylon, and we know the story about how they refused the table of the king and preserved their integrity and excelled among all of the captives taken off into exile. In the second chapter, we have a very interesting prophecy. And it surrounds the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, our pastor did a very able job of preaching, including this in his sermon last Sunday. And I hope you heard that. If you haven't heard it, if you weren't there, go listen to it on the video that's preserved. It was an excellent job. But here we have, like many of the prophecies, that has been misappropriated. And it's found its worst misappropriation in the Scofield Reference Bible, in the comments on this vision made by C.I. Scofield. Now, it's been done damage to elsewhere, but it makes us think that this prophecy is about a future Antichrist and his kingdom and where it will arise. But that's not at all the message of this vision. It doesn't concern itself with any specific nation. In fact, I think we would do well if we would actually read part of that prophecy in the Septuagint, an earlier Greek translation of the scripture. Our Old Testament is largely the work the Masoretes, the Masoretic text between 200 and 800 A.D. And these were Jesus-hating rabbis that translated the Old Testament for us. And there was a bit of revisionist interpretation. And that was also, it also contaminated the Septuagint by a Jewish translator by the name of Theodotion. And so when you read it in Theodotion, it'll read more like the Masoretic text. And I think that's also a bit of revisionist translation. But when we go to the Septuagint, a Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament done several hundred years before Jesus, we will see a little bit more information emerge and understand a little better what this prophecy is talking about. So in this dream that Nebuchadnezzar has, he sees a vision of a great statue, an image, and it's impressive. And he sees that it's a statue of a man. It has a head of gold. It has arms of silver, a torso of bronze and legs of iron, and feet that, interestingly, are iron mixed with baked clay. It's an interesting admixture that don't really mix well together. Well, that's the point. And then we see a stone carved without hands that represents Christ, who subdues all the nations of the earth. The point at which that event happens, we're told in the Revelation, is coincident with the incarnation, with the coming of Christ, that he is the rock hewn without hands that smashes and subdues the nations of the earth and fills the earth as a great mountain. And we see that in the 12th chapter of the Revelation, which is a description of the incarnation, in the phrase that says, the kingdoms of this world are now the kingdoms of our God and his Christ. So at that point, the nations are the inheritance of Christ, in keeping with the words of the psalmist, with God speaking to his Christ, ask and I will give you the nations for your inheritance. And so we, by extension, are joint heirs. So that's the story of the statue. I'm going to go to, it'll take me a little bit to change resources, but I think we would benefit from a reading from the Septuagint. Now, I'm actually going to access the NETS translation, the New English translation of the Septuagint, NETS. And I'm going to go to Daniel 2. Take me a little bit to scroll down there. I actually had it parked on the 7th chapter. So, if you recall the story, Nebuchadnezzar has asked the wise men of Babylon to not just give him the interpretation of a dream, but to tell him what the dream was. And so in Daniel's recounting of the dream in the 36th verse, he now gives the interpretation of the dream. It says, and I'll read this from the NETS translation of what they term the primary texts of the Septuagint. And also an explanation before I get started. When you see the Old Testament quoted in the New Testament, the quotes are verbatim from the Septuagint and in concordance with fragments found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint aren't entirely concordant, nor are the Dead Sea Scrolls concordant with the Masoretic text entirely. But it has far more in common with the Septuagint than it does the work product of the Masoretes. Now, in Daniel 2 and 36, it says, this was the vision. Now we will also tell the meaning in the presence of the king. You, our King of kings, and you, the Lord of heaven, has given the kingdom and power and honor and glory in the whole world of humans. and wild animals and birds of the air and fish of the sea. He has delivered them into your hands to rule over all. You are the gold head. And after you will arise a kingdom smaller than yours, and another kingdom of bronze, which will rule over the whole earth, and another kingdom strong as iron, which saws everything and cuts down every tree, and the whole earth will be shaken. And as you saw its feet partly of iron and partly of potter's ware, there will be another kingdom in two parts, and some of the iron base will be in it, just as you saw the iron commixed with the clayware. Part of the kingdom will be strong, and part of it will be broken. And as you saw the iron admixed with the clayware, they will be commixed races of humans. But they will not be in agreement or well disposed to one another. Even as iron is not able to be blended with earthenware. And in the times of these kings, the God of heaven will set up another kingdom that will be forever and will not be corrupted. And this kingdom will never permit another nation. This is key. And this kingdom, the kingdom of Christ, will never permit another nation to rule the world, is implicit. But it will crush and abolish those kingdoms, and the kingdom of Christ will stand forever. I inserted Christ, and it will stand forever. Just as you have seen a stone cut out of a mountain without hands, and it ground the earthenware and the iron and the bronze and silver and gold to powder. The great God has shown the king what will be at the end of the days, and the vision is precise and the meaning of it trustworthy. Now we'll find that the end time that he's speaking of is the coming of Jesus and the judgment of the nation that rejects its king. These are the end times for Daniel's people that he will, that are the preoccupation of Daniel's prophecy. And so the thing that each of these kingdoms has in common is Babylon didn't rule the whole world. There was a lot of nations on earth that probably didn't know who the Babylonians were. Likewise with Media and with the Medes and the Persians, also the Greeks and the Romans, which are the nations that we'll find fulfill this prophecy. But they are all the nations that subjugated the children of Israel, that subjugated Judah. And then after Rome, the end of and with the desolation that the Roman subjugation brought, the diaspora. And the chosen people were scattered throughout the world, and they did not admix well, they did not assimilate well, and that's what's being described in the feet of clay and iron. It's not so much the nature of the nation in question as it is the nature of its relationship with the chosen people of God. Now, this is very important because a lot of our past understanding of this prophecy of Scripture, at least in the tradition that I was raised in, is that this is an end-time kingdom. But reading this from the Septuagint, it makes it very clear that the final kingdom of earth is the kingdom of Christ, not the kingdom of Antichrist. So, let's move on and see how much ground we can actually cover in Daniel. So in the third chapter, we have the story of the fiery furnace, and that's a great Bible story. It's a great thing to teach in Sunday school. It lends itself well to pictorial type of learning aids, and it's just a great story. The take-home message of the story is that where there is adversity, where there is trial, where there is tribulation for the people of God, Jesus is there. Need not fear. Need not plan our escape, because Jesus reigns in his church. So in the fourth chapter, we see Nebuchadnezzar's dream of a tree. In this, it foretells the fall of the great Nebuchadnezzar and his humbling before God, and then his reinstatement as the most powerful king in the world. Now, a very interesting story in Daniel 5. Here we see King Belshazzar giving a great banquet and big drinking party. And it says that while Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem. So here he's about to desecrate holy artifacts from the temple. And the sin of Babylon is already in the process of being judged, and Belshazzar is unaware of it. But this final coup de grace, this final desecration of the holy items that belong in the temple of God, will have some very interesting consequences. Because in the 5th verse it says, that suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. Now, there's an apparition of a hand writing on the wall, and we know, we'll skip ahead here, that the king's wise men don't have any idea what it's saying. And the text, even when we're able to read it, is a little bit cryptic, and you might not get the meaning of what's being said, even if you understood what words were being written. And he gets his diviners, astrologers, enchanters all involved, and none of them can tell him what it means. And his wife hears, the queen mother, his mother hears the commotion and comes in and tells Belshazzar, you need Daniel. Daniel will tell you the meaning. And so we see it's a very interesting picture, a word picture being drawn here. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin, or parson. Mene, which is the Aramaic word for a minim, which is a coin. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Tekel simply means weigh. And Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Now, if you know what Mene, Tekel, and Perez mean, Daniel's having to ascribe the meaning to this, because what's being painted here, the picture that just the words themselves are painting, is having a scale set before you and taking coins, mene, and dropping it into the weight pan. And then placing another weight of how much you owe, which is how coinage was exchanged, and seeing how much it takes to level out the scale. It's very interesting that a paris, the parson, is the word for a half shekel coin. So here we say a minim in the pan. You weigh it, and you're short a half shekel. That the half shekel just happens to be the amount that was required annually for the temple tax. So here is this word picture. Belshazzar, let's see how much you're going to fall short here. It just happens to be the temple tax, and you have just taken the artifacts from the temple and desecrated them. It's fascinating. But then the meaning for Belshazzar is what Daniel interprets. It's an interesting word picture. What you have has been found lacking a half shekel, and God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting, and your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. The collector is right outside the gates for the debt you owe. An amazing story. Now, in the 6th chapter, we see the story of Daniel in the lion's den. And Darius, now the Persian king that has taken over from the Babylonian king Belshazzar, is now in charge. And his advisors, wanting to get at Daniel, convinced the king that no one should pray to any god but him. And of course, they know that Daniel, his long history of non-compliance with such commands, and they very accurately predict that he will ignore such a thing and pray to his God 3 times a day as always. And so he's thrown into the lion's den. Now there is actually another occasion that's spoken of in Scripture. There is an extended portion of Daniel that is recorded in the Septuagint. And in that extended portion of Daniel is the story of Daniel, Bel, and the dragon, or Daniel, Bel, and the snake. And it's a fascinating story that lands Daniel in the lion's den for 7 days, not just one night. And it seems to precede this story of the lion's den, so under a different king. Now, what's interesting to me about that story is we see a cameo appearance by the prophet Habakkuk. And Habakkuk is carrying food out to the gatherers, and God comes to Habakkuk and says, take that to Daniel in the lion's den in Babylon. Well, Habakkuk as a prophet says, I haven't seen a lion's den. I haven't seen Babylon. I don't even know the way to get there. And so the Spirit of God takes Habakkuk by the hair of the head along with the food and delivers it to Daniel in the lion's den. And so but it's a fascinating story too, and we may actually get to that sometime, how that Daniel reveals the fraud that was the god of Babylon. But it's an interesting story. So this is a story that we're generally very familiar with. Now, when we get to Daniel 7, we begin to have a much more interesting task at hand to interpret this vision of prophecy and determine what it says to us. Because here we have the description of 4 beasts in Daniel's dream. And there are 4 beasts. The first is like a lion and has wings of an eagle. He says, I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a human being, and the mind of a human is given to it. Now, what we'll see is this is not describing so much the nature of the nations as it does describe the fate of Israel under their domination. And so we'll see a second beast. It looks like a bear. It's larger on one side than the other, and it has 3 ribs between its teeth. It was told, get up and eat your fill of flesh. And we know that this to be the Medes and the Persians, the Medo-Persian Empire, with the larger portion of that being Persia. And this is after that I looked at before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard. And on its back it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast has 4 heads. And this gets to be important in that we'll see this resurface in the Revelation. So we have three beasts so far, one like a lioness, one like a bear, and one like a leopard, and another that's different. It says, after that in my vision at night I looked, and there before me was a fourth beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. Now, here we have 4 beasts, and between them, they have 7 heads. Where do we see a beast that is described as like a lion, like a bear, and like a leopard with 7 heads? Revelation chapter 13. We see that beast emerge from the sea. And it is a chimera. It is a mixture of all of the beasts in Daniel 7, including the one whose fate we're going to read about here in just a second. Now, here, what was really very interesting is the horn that rises up from the head of the fourth beast. It said it had 10 horns. And while I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up among them. And 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes like the eyes of a human being and a mouth that spoke boastfully. Now, if we see this description of the little horn also resurfaces in the beast from the sea. So the beast from the sea that contains all 7 heads of the 4, and the description, parts of the description of the 4 beasts from Daniel 7, begins to speak boastfully. And so this little horn in Daniel is now described as a chimera, a mixture of all the 4 beasts, including the one head with the deadly wound. Now, let's read Daniel's interpretation. Then I want to go back and tell and make the point that Daniel's vision makes. It says, "Then I wanted to know the meaning of the fourth beast, which was different from all the others and most terrifying, with its iron teeth and bronze claws, the beast that crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. I also wanted to know about the 10 horns on its head and about the other horn that came up, before which 3 of them fell. The horn that looked more imposing than the others, that had eyes and a mouth that spoke boastfully. And as I watched, this horn was waging war against the holy people and defeating them, until the Ancient of Days came and pronounced judgment in favor of the holy people of the Most High, and the time came when they possessed the kingdom." Now, we're going to go into the history that this is describing. For us, history, the future for Daniel. It says, "He gave me this explanation. The fourth beast is a fourth kingdom that will appear on earth. It will be different from all the other kingdoms and will devour the whole earth, trampling it down and crushing it. The 10 horns are 10 kings who will come from this kingdom. After them, another king will arise, different from the earlier ones. He will subdue 3 kings. He will speak against the Most High and oppress his holy people and try to change the set times and the laws. The holy people will be delivered into his hands for a time, times, and half a time." Now, what's the duration of the reign of the beast from the sea in Revelation 13? I think it uses 42 months, which are 3.5 years. Time, times, and half a time. And so we're talking about, the Revelation is speaking of the same period of time as John's vision is in chapters 13 and 14, the 7th chapter. It says, "But the court will sit, and his power will be taken away and completely destroyed forever." The stone will strike the feet, and the entirety of the kingdoms of this world will be placed under his feet. Well, let's go back and kind of illuminate this a little bit. Now, you remember that the beast from the sea has one head that has a deadly wound. Well, let's read about the fate of the fourth beast with one head. One of the seven heads, and the fourth beast, it says, I continued to watch because of the boastful words the horn was speaking. This is the 11th verse. I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority, but they were allowed to live for a period of time. That's talking about the fate of the nation of Israel under the domination of Babylon, Persia, and Greece. It was allowed to live for a little while there, but under Rome, it's destroyed. It's completely desolated. The son of destruction presides over a terrible time in the history of the Jewish nation where it is desolated. And there are Talmudic sources and historical sources that say that the Romans rode their horses in blood up to the nostrils of the horses. In the vision of John, he says up to the horse's bridle, which is, of course, the same level. Now, this period of time is the last of the three great Jewish rebellions that begin in 66 AD, result in the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD, continues worldwide as a Jewish rebellion called the Kitos Rebellion, Kitos, if you want to look it up. And then finally, the Bar Kokhba revolt, where Bar Kokhba, representing a Zionism that lusts for the land but rejects the God of the land, comes to power, and he dominates the Christians. He goes about to reset times and laws, and he even prints up coins that have his star stamped on them, the mark of that beast was the star that he took as his name, as a play on his name. And this historically was a one in Aramaic, Ben Kosova, which Rabbi Akiva, the beast from the land, the false prophet of rabbinical Judaism, in the person of Rabbi Akiva, he takes Bar Kokhba and declares him Messiah and anoints him in the ruins of the temple as Messiah and Prince of Israel. And Bar Kokhba begins to declare that he is in fact that Messiah and a gift from heaven. And he is called by Rabbi Akiva and takes the name Bar Kokhba, which is a reference to the messianic prophecy of Balaam in the book of Numbers, where he says, I see him, but not now. A star shall arise out of Jacob, as a messianic reference. And Bar Kokhba means son of a star. Now, the Christians saw this, and they called him Bar Kokhba, or son of a lie. And later rabbis would recognize him as an antichrist, as a false Messiah, and would also give him the name of Bar Kokhba, son of a lie, because they had great hopes. And Rabbi Akiva declared him to be the Messiah. He declared himself to be the Messiah. He was that son of destruction that's spoken of. And so Jesus, if you remember, warned people of his time. He said, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel standing in the holy place, leave. And Christians of that time, in the time of Bar Kokhba, he began his reign in 132 AD. It ended violently in 135 AD after 3.5 years of domination of Judah. the son of destruction. But when Christians saw that and they recognized him as that Antichrist, they left just in time because the judgment was most severe. Jewish sources say 800,000 Jews died in one day at Betar, the fall of the fortress of Betar, just outside of the ruined city of Jerusalem and the new Roman city of Aelia Capitolina. Well, I think that, while I'm at it, if you want to study that history, there are YouTube videos, and even Wikipedia does a fair job of detailing the history of that time. Bar Kokhba, Barkochba. Just Google it. Listen to some things on YouTube, because this history, now it's not that we have overlooked this history in our interpretation of the prophecies of Daniel. We were unaware of it. As I mentioned earlier in this lesson, this history was really not available in any detail until the 1960s, when caves were unsealed that had a lot of the documents. The coins had been found all over Palestine, and with his stamp and his mark on them, without which you could not buy or sell. And there's some interesting, a lot of other interesting details about how it corresponds with the prophecy of the Revelation. Now you understand that all these events were in John's future, just like they're in Daniel's future, and yet we get amazing detail about the nature of the fulfillment of the prophetic visions. And so we see that Bar Kokhba, for instance, makes his soldiers show their allegiance by cutting off a finger of their right hand. It's just, there are many details like that, and we will get into that at some point in the future, perhaps. It's beyond the scope of our study of Daniel here. We just understand that Daniel is a very detailed, forward-looking prophecy, not a retrospective description. But now here is the real point of Daniel 7. And it's not a preoccupation with this Antichrist that it describes, Bar Kokhba. The gematria of his name, represented in numbers in Hebrew, just happens to be 666. Now it's very interesting that some manuscripts use 616 instead of 666. And it's also interesting that the gematria for the pejorative renaming Bar Kokhba is 616, and some manuscripts of Revelation in Greek use 616 instead of 666. I can just see some scribe saying, I'm not going to call him son of a star, I'm going to call him son of a lie, and put down the appropriate gematria. So it's interesting that both names have their representation in the number used for the beast in the Revelation in the ancient Greek texts. But now here's the real point. It says, if we go to verse 8, I'll kind of start. It says, this horn had eyes like the eyes of a human being and a mouth that spoke boastfully. As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. So here we see something that's reminiscent of Ezekiel's vision of the throne of the glory of God. It says a river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. So this is speaking to violent judgment already in the words. It's very clear to anyone in the ancient Near East that what's about to happen is not going to be good. Well, it'll be good, but for some folks it won't. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. And then I continued to watch because of the boastful words the horn was speaking, and I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority, but were allowed to live for a period of time. 13. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, like a human being. That's a Ben Adam, son of man. And a lot of people think that this is where the title that Jesus uses in the New Testament, Son of Man, comes from. But actually, this is just saying one that looks like a human being. It doesn't give a title, Son of Man. However, that is who it's talking about, is Jesus. But the title, Son of Man, comes out of the prophecy of Enoch. But he says, the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. And you know how we mentioned before in our study of Ezekiel, that for the deity to come in the clouds is to come in violent judgment. He said he was given, and he, coming with the clouds of heaven, he approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. This is that rock hewn without hands in chapter 2. This is the everlasting king and the inheritor of the nations. And so here we see the story that's very concordant with the vision that John is given on Patmos. And we see the kingdom that is destroyed, is beaten to death, and its body burned. And we see this in the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. But the beast that emerges from the sea after the destruction of Jerusalem is now described as a clumsy chimera with features of all these four beasts and all its 7 heads, including the one with the deadly wound that seems to have been healed. In other words, it's back. And that describes the events of Scripture in the New Testament recounted in the Olivet Discourse. Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21, all record the words of Jesus that says, this generation will not pass away until all these things are fulfilled. And Daniel nails it, and so does John. Well, I think that's enough to soak up, maybe too much to soak up. And I may have to come back and explain that. Please let me know at church if this is clear, because it is extremely important, because we don't know what Daniel says about our future unless we know what has been fulfilled in the past and what remains in our future. Very important to know what these last days that we're rapidly approaching are actually going to be like. Because I think the picture that we have painted in the absence of information has been inaccurate. It has not been accurate. And it's very important that we know which of the prophetic words apply to our future and which do not, by knowing the fulfillment in the past. So it's a very important point. I think that eschatology, the study of the final days, or the end time study, final things, the eschaton, is extremely important because in the absence of information, we human beings tend to concoct their own stories. And billions of dollars have been invested in and made from the Left Behind stories. It's an industry of its own. And does not come from Scripture. It comes from Hollywood. It comes from Freemasonry. It comes from Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. It is not the eschatology of Scripture. the end times that are approaching us will be far different than they have been painted for us by Hollywood. So just be aware that we are going to unpack what the Bible actually says and read it plainly, and it will tell us a different story than what we're used to hearing. So until next week.